Hi, it's Kathy, and I chose a card from Mary, Queen of Angels by Doreen Virtue. And the card I picked was prayer. Instead of worrying, I pray about this situation to bring about real solutions. So don't worry, just pray. And we are reading from Reverend Moon's autobiography. We're still reading. Now, they were in the concentration camp, and here we go. There was, I think, I'm sorry. It says, as the bombing became more intense, guards began executing prisoners. They called out the prisoners' numbers and told them to come with 3 days' food rations and a shovel. The prisoners assumed they were being moved to another prison, but in reality, they were marched into the mountains, made to dig a hole, and then killed and buried there. Prisoners were being called out in the order of the length of their sentences, with those with the longest sentences being called first. I realized that my turn would come the next day. The night before my scheduled execution, the bombs fell like rain in the monsoon season. It was October 13, 1950, and the U.S. forces, having succeeded in the Incheon landing, had come up the peninsula to take Pyongyang and were now pressing against Hungnam. The U.S. military attacked Hungnam with full force that night, with B-29 bombers in the lead. The bombing was so intense that it seemed all of Hungnam had been turned into a sea of fire. The high walls around the prison began to fall, and the guards ran for their lives. Finally, the gate of the prison that had kept us in that place opened. At around 2 o'clock in the morning on the next day, I walked calmly out of Hungnam prison with dignity. I had been imprisoned for 2 years and 8 months in Hungnam and Pyongyang, so I was a terrible sight. My underwear and outerwear were in tatters. Dressed in those rags, instead of going to my hometown, I headed to Pyongyang with a group of people who had followed me in prison. Some chose to come with me instead of going in search of their wives and children. I could imagine how my mother must be crying every day out of concern for my welfare, that it was more important that I look after the members of my congregation in Pyongyang. On the way to Pyongyang, we could see clearly how North Korea had prepared for this war. Major cities were all connected by 2-lane roads that could be used for military purposes in an emergency. Many of the bridges had been constructed with enough cement to let them withstand the weight of 30-ton tanks. The fertilizer that the prisoners in Hungnam prison had sacrificed their lives to put into bags was sent to the Soviet Union in exchange for outdated but still lethal weaponry that was then deployed along the 38th parallel. Okay, now there's one point. We were refugees on the run who still had to eat. We went into homes whose inhabitants had headed south before us and searched for rice or any other food that might have been left behind. We boiled anything we found, whether it was rice, barley, or potatoes. I'm skipping a few things because I want to get to something. After walking a long distance, we were approaching the northern bank of the Incheon River. Somehow I felt it was important that we cross the river quickly, that we didn't have a moment to spare. I felt strongly that we had to get over this obstacle for us to stay alive. I pushed Wonpil Kim mercilessly. Wonpil was young, and he would fall asleep as we walked, but I kept forcing him on and pulling the bicycle. We covered 32 kilometers that night and reached the bank of the Incheon River. Fortunately, the river was frozen solid. We followed some refugees in front of us across the river. A long line of refugees stretched out behind us. As soon as we had crossed the river, however, the UN forces closed the crossing and stopped letting people across. Had we arrived at the river even a few minutes later, we would not have been able to cross. After we had crossed, Wampil Kim looked back at the road we had come on and asked, "How did you know the river crossing was about to be closed?" Somehow I just knew, I said. This kind of thing happens often to anyone who takes the path of heaven. People often don't know that salvation is just beyond the next obstacle. We didn't have a single moment to waste, and if necessary, I would have grabbed you by the scruff of the neck and pulled you across. Wampil Kim seemed moved by my words, but my heart was uneasy. When we arrived at the point where the 38th parallel divided the peninsula in two, I placed one foot in South Korea and one foot in North Korea and began to pray. For now we are pushed southward like this, but soon I will return to the north. I will gather the forces of the free world behind me to liberate North Korea and unite North and South. This was how I had prayed during the entire time we walked along with the refugees. I wish I could read the whole thing to you, but it's an incredible story. Being in a concentration camp for about 2 years, and then the U.S. forces bombing, and then the gates just opened and he was able to just walk out. It's amazing. Amazing story. God was definitely with him on his journey. And so I pray for everyone to seek in your heart, what is God's will for me? And then God will be with you on your journey. If you are doing God's will, He can act in your life. So I pray for that for all of us, myself included, that I can do God's will and that He will be a part of my life. Thank you for listening.